Hello and welcome to Sake Revolution. I am your host, John Puma.
And I am your host, Timothy Sullivan. Today we are continuing our discussion with the authors of the new and fantastic sake book, Exploring the World of Japanese Craft Sake. Now, if you missed part one of our discussion, be sure to go back to the previous episode and listen to part one of our interview. But for now, please welcome back to the show authors Nancy Matsumoto and Michael Tremblay. Welcome back to the show to both of you.
Hi,
nice thanks for having us again. Woohoo!
Wow. I'm glad you guys can make it again. Hopping right into things. Last week, we talked a little bit about the structure of the book, what your writing process was like, the challenges of co-authorship during a pandemic, and then we rounded it up with some really, really lovely sake from Nara. Today, we're going to continue along those lines and talk a little bit more about some specifics in the book and a chapter that I really thoroughly enjoyed, the bar hopping chapter.
John is actually an expert in Japanese bar hopping.
Well, it's kind of funny because as I was going through it, I'm like, you guys went to so many of like my favorite places and talked about them in there. And for me, it was like great to see places that I really love going to and really appreciate being like, you know, immortalized in text. And that was a lot of fun. That kind of style, the Japanese style of bar hopping, like what you guys experienced, meeting people along the way, those adventures, those stories is a very uniquely Japanese experience. So what were some of the most fun run-ins you guys had?
Yeah, well, I can talk about my favorite bar experience was in Fukuoka. Do you guys know Kumorebi? And
I love Kumorebi.
Yeah, isn't it great? That was one of my favorite experiences. So this was a really, really hot day. I guess it was July in Fukuoka, and you know, the humidity is off the charts. We've had a really long day reporting. And often, you know, we're just so engrossed in like preparing for the interviews, getting to the interviews that we're not really planning our bar hopping very well. And it's kind of like, okay, we're at the hotel. Where are we going?
Priorities.
I know we had our priorities all backwards for some reason. No, we managed to hit some great places. So somehow we heard about this. So really, it was like, I felt like the humidity was, off the charts. Just felt like we were swimming to get to this bar that wasn't that far from our hotel. It's a small, really nice little bar, very snug. And we peek in and we can see how it's just beautifully, you know, that light wood pine paneled kind of place. And it just looks so well lit and so welcoming. And we're just dying to sit down and have a glass of sake. Sorry, we're all full.
Oh.
So the server, who's very kind, I think her name was Aiko-san, she shows us to this little log on the ground outside the bar. So we're sitting like drenched in sweat, sitting on this little log. And she said, well, you can order sake here. And we said, okay. So she brought 3 isho bean. I think we just asked for local, and she brought 3 isho bean. And one of them was the first time that we had zenkuro. And it was a collaboration between Kanhokuto in Fukushima and Kumazawa, the maker of Tensei in Kanagawa. And so there were just all these local sake. They were all delicious. And we're kind of like, okay, well, at least we're drinking sake. We're just looking at a little electric vending machine and it's really hot, but okay, we got something. And then we're about to sort of like slink off and look for someplace to get food when all of a sudden 2 seats open up. So we're just overjoyed. It's like, you know, it's like getting to the oasis when you've been in the desert for 3 months. So we sit down and we happen to sit next to this very nice guy who's an intellectual property lawyer. And we start chatting him up. And then this really eccentric guy sits down. He's like dripping in sweat. He's mopping his forehead. And I say in the book, he reminds me of the comic book guy in The Simpsons, only not so mean. Like he's just like a super otaku, sake geek type. And he's like telling us all of the sakes he got and how many little sake fridges he has at home because he buys all the sake with his winnings from gambling at pachinko. And then he starts telling us about his latest find and how we have to get it. We can get it at the train station at Fukuoka. And we're saying, wow, we have a really early train. I don't know. And then he's going like, I don't care. I'll send it to you in America. And then our friend next to us says, oh, Nancy has relatives in Saga. And so he says, I'll send it to your grandmother. It was just like one of these crazy nights where by the end we're all friends and we're all taking pictures together. And I mean, they're kind of really typical Japanese. Like you go in knowing no one and then you end up having a great time. And, you just drink a lot and have a great time. So that was one of my favorites. Michael, you probably have yours too.
Well, I have a lot of favorites, but I'd have to say as a caveat that one thing that I loved that we did on this trip was everywhere we went, in the fridges, as you're sitting down at the bar, you're seeing brands that you can't get in Toronto. You're seeing highly coveted brands that you'd have even trouble finding in Japan to buy, to bring home. So it's really hard to resist the urge to go for those because you know them and you love them. And one of the funnest things was asking, what sake are you passionate about right now? Because I know I love it when people come to Key and are like, tell us stories, like just take us on an adventure. And I'm like, these are the new sakes I'm in love with because it just arrived and I'm so excited to tell those stories. So it was really fun hearing from all the proprietors we went to. Some of them had a lot more experience in sake than others, but they were all equally passionate about it. And that was so much fun. We learned a lot from it. And it was also, we learned about a lot of brands that we never have heard of before, or probably wouldn't have even thought to try. So that was really cool too. It just kind of opened that sake world a little bit larger.
Well, you guys it's such a fun chapter about your sake bar nights out in Japan. And anyone who's traveled through Japan on a sake quest has had many of those nights. And you have a little call out here. I'm sure you get asked all the time, I'm going to Japan. What do you guys recommend? You're the experts. Where should I go? And you have a little recommendation here how people going to Japan can enjoy their own sake adventure. What you say in the book here is you say, our recommendation for your own trip to Japan: walk into a bar with no expectations and place your blind trust in the sake expert. Then wait to have your mind blown. That sums it up perfectly.
It does. Yeah.
It's awesome.
Now, one of the experiences that comes to mind that's not sake related was really fun because it was with our friend Carlin in Hokkaido. We did a little sake trip with him, but we on our first night there, he took us to Sapporo Beer Hall, but they serve Genghis Khan, and it's this mutton that you kind of grill on your own grill or skillet. And so, it's winter. So I'm wearing this cashmere sweater and whatever, things that are really highly absorbent of smells. And as soon as we walk into this hall, all you can smell is frying lamb and mutton. And they gave us plastic bags for our jackets and bibs and all that and aprons. And this was at the beginning of our trip. And it's like I feel like every time I opened my suitcase for a few days, it was like, Genghis Khan again. Great, because it was so aromatic. Anyway, that's one of the stories.
If only they would have given you a spare sweater, that would have been great.
But John, what you said about like a lot of the places that are in our book are some of your favorites. That makes me happy because we want to get the right places in there, and it was hard. There's so many amazing places in Japan to go to that if we went back, as much as I would love to go back to the sake bars in our book, there's so many others I want to try. And so it's, I guess for the listeners, we've got some great places that we had, but there's all kinds of other adventures to experience, and don't be afraid to go in there. And as the non-Japanese person, when we went to places like Komorebi, I know Nancy pokes fun of it in the book, but I have my sake scholar book on there. I have a periodic table of rice, and I don't really speak much Japanese, but Nancy would be in a conversation. I'm like, well, I'm going to dive in and have a conversation. And it was always a good conversation starter to show this. And it was always like, and it would lead to all kinds of conversation. And then someone would grab my phone to show someone else. And we would just have this fun thing. And so it helps me bond and kind of get comfortable with the being outside of your comfort zone, so to speak. And the sake helps, of course, with that. But yeah.
Yeah, John and I did a whole episode on survival Japanese for Japanese sake bars, and we taught people how to say "osusume onegai shimasu,"
Very good.
which was our most valuable phrase to get a recommendation.
I do think that the recommendation to go and find your own adventure in a way is so very useful. Especially, I think it's especially going to be more useful when Japan opens up again and people start to go back, because they're going to find that a lot of the places that we talk about may not be there anymore. These are just the places that we had great experiences. These are the places that we walked into and had an adventure. And I really love that you're pointing out that, like, it's not about the place, it's the culture, and it's still there. You're going to find a place that's going to have, you're going to have your own great story to write about. Don't always hunt down the places that we went to. Try to find your own.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are going to be great stories about survival and pivoting and redefining bars. They've been through so much. It would be really interesting when we all get to go back to see what's happened.
No, the book overall spends a good amount of time, and I love this part of your book, was explaining certain things about the sake industry and about sake history. You piece a lot of things together and you go into a lot of the history, and that is fantastic, and I learned so much from that. But I have to say, the one chapter that really surprised me and I really want to talk to you about is the chapter on the future of sake. Some things you wrote in there really surprised me. So I just wanted to throw a few topics out there and talk to both of you about what you picked up from industry insiders and what your personal opinions are about the sake industry future for the next 10 to 20 years. The first thing I read in the book that surprised me was about the death of Ginjo. Has Ginjo run its course? That was shocking to read. So what's the... I'm really attached to Ginjo.
Oh, no. I hope it didn't make you cry, Timothy. Well, we have a whole chapter on the birth. So
yes, it was birth to death of Ginjo. Yes. Yeah. So what's the
next
story?
Will be afterlife.
What's the story with the death of Ginjo?
Well, there have been so many births and rebirths over the long history of sake that I think we are at a really interesting time where you've got the changing of the guard. You've got all these younger generations taking over the family business that went to university and did a master's in molecular biology and understand yeast, but also traveled. We're at a time where pandemic aside, it was really easy to fly to other countries when you're a student and see what's going on in wine world or in beer making and see the spirit of experimentation and come back and do that. And what I love is and we're going to be trying the Mutsuhasen shortly, and it's a great brewery that's kind of has a foot grounded in tradition and is forging into all kinds of really cool things. But for me, the future is interesting. It's not necessarily the death of Ginjo, but I like to imagine what is going to be the next chapter, because brewers have perfected sake making. They know so much now that they didn't even know 30 years ago. And they're not afraid to try things that have not been tried before. And that's really, really interesting. And one of the things that is interesting to me is this whole idea of the henpei and genkai rice polishing. Daishichi has been doing it for a while. They've done the flat rice polishing, the henpei style, and where they were milling the right parts of the rice. In general, when you're polishing rice, you're conventionally, you're removing the unwanted parts, but you're also removing some of the wanted parts at the same time. And so it wasn't really that accurate. You were just polishing down to a number. And so this whole idea of Satake, who invented the vertical rice polishing machine, it's easier for them to polish the rice based on the rice that they're using. Yamada Nishiki, for instance, has a different starch chart compared to Omachi, which is Omachi has this big fat shimpaku or starch chart, and Yamada Nishiki is this long. And so polishing them the same way, it's not accurate. And so this whole idea of the henpei genkai means that there's implications on now we can actually start removing less. So It means that you could polish the rice down to 70%, so just removing 30%, but it tastes like a sake where the rice was polished to 50% in the conventional method. So that tells me, well, if you can do that and there's results to show for it, like what does it mean to the ginjo and what daiginjo means? The other side of the coin with the ginjo is that some brewers, I've been told, are tired of being told by restaurateurs or consumers that a daiginjo has to be this way. I think some of them feel like they're being put into a box of what daiginjo is. And if they're trying to do something with rice polished to 50% that doesn't fit necessarily into that box, it could be panned by them or something. So I think those two parts is, to me, implies maybe change will come. But there's a lot of brewers in Japan and only a very few doing it right now. So there's, I think, a long way to go to this evolution of where ginjo heads.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to be said about the concept that Say My Boy is like getting further away from what flavor profiles come from those milling percentages in a way that wasn't always the case. I think that maybe when they put that together, it made a lot of sense. And as time goes on, as you pointed out with this new technology, it just doesn't match up anymore. And so does that old system really serve us? Well, we'll see what they do.
But it's interesting too, when you think of ginjo back then, and this Tokute Meishoshu system, it was set to go with these early systems. And so it's indicative of what brewers could do back then. Like if you're brewing to 50%, that's like Mount Everest. It's like, you're going to do that. It's going to be really hard to do. And you're going to be very careful with what you do. Nowadays, it's really easy to do it comparatively to 40, 50 years ago.
So you guys also talked a little bit about the, I love the phrase, aroma bombs and wine-like sakes, which is a bit of a trend, especially the wine-like. We see a lot of breweries that are going after that high acidity style. Where do you think that's going to end up fitting in?
Well, one of the things that I found really interesting that we put in that chapter, comment that Rumiko Moriki from Moriki Shizo in Mie told us, and it really had to do with all of this sort of innovation in sake that is really very exciting in some way. Brewing a sake with Kijoshu and then aging it in a Scotch barrel, or brewing it with a shochu yeast or a wine yeast, or trying to replicate the quality of Sauvignon Blanc in a sake. There are all of these really super kind of out there. And I think they're all really addressed at capturing that foreign market. And I think so much of what we heard in Japan was the future is in the foreign market, and we really have to get those Western drinkers in. And Moriki-san's point was, for us as domestic brewers, how far do we go down that path? And at what point do we really have to pay attention to our domestic market? And so many people, like when we were at Sohomare, Kono-san said, my father always taught me that you really have to first come your local customers. They're your most important customers. And we heard that a number of times. So it's kind of this push-pull of identity for these brewers, and they're trying to figure that out.
There's also this influence of wine culture seeping in with some brewers. And I don't think it's as bad now that some sakes have this acidity that's through the roof. I think 30 years ago, that acidity, it was like, what the heck are you doing? And maybe you were thrown out of the brewery, head first into the snowbank or something. But nowadays, I think it's, especially with younger generations, they can connect with it. There's a new way of connecting with it. It's making sake fresh as well. I mean, younger generations do look at sake like it's grandpa's or grandma's drink. It's so these new methods, if they're a way of engaging new consumers or younger consumers, it's not a bad thing, because I think there's huge amount of room for a traditional sake maker that's making traditional sake brewery. And I want that to continue. I love historical sakes as well. I find those are really interesting to try. But same where you can do with 4 ingredients, rice, water, kojikin, and yeast, to push the envelope. It's really interesting to me what brewers are doing. Our chapter, the second part of the book, The Alchemist, is true. Like these people are magicians with what they're doing with these 4 ingredients, if you ask me. And I'm also often asked, Michael, you're a sake expert. Do you make your own sake? And it's like, hell no. I will not even try. I mean, I'll go to a brewery and work a little bit and pretend I'm doing some work, but making sake, I just couldn't do it. Yeah.
It is so interesting to think about the future of sake and how, it may be some brewers may be chasing wine profiles right now. And as Nancy mentioned, maybe some brewers are looking at what's happening overseas. But one thing I think that ties all of these trends together, we've heard from brewers that they have a desire for sake to become a world beverage. Have you guys heard that as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that informs a lot of the back and forth about what the correct future course is for the sake industry. I'm curious to see how much of what's happening here in the States or at breweries in Europe is going to reflect back to Japan, and they might start to amend those very strict rules about ingredients and production methods to come up and innovate with new styles. Do you think that's in the cards for the future?
I think so. I think history tends to repeat itself. And in the 60s, when the old system was replaced with the Tokuteme Shoshu system, a part of that was a product of some brewers revolting against the current class system and the heavy taxations on quality premium sake, and they were just stopping. And that's been echoed in Italian wine as well. If you go back to the so-called Super Tuscans, it was the same thing. These wines that broke the rules and were kind of, okay, well, you've got to be called a table wine. And they were fetching cult wine prices and winning, awards and things like that. It makes the system not work properly. And right now, up to this point, I think the grading system has worked really well at keeping the majority of sakes within that kind of definition. But as more and more kind of pop outside the lines and are making it going, it's okay, I don't need the system, I'm doing this, it starts to make the system more irrelevant. I do think that also the influences, my hope is what the amazing things going on in the US with the brewing scene is catching attention, I'm sure, in Japan, and that will have some influence back home. And I'm hoping to see more collaborations. There's already some really wonderful collaborations starting. And this is really cool too, is brewers from other places working together to try to do things. And so there's even more collaborations in Japan doing that as well. And, again, that it echoes Italy, because Piemonte, the northwest of Italy, there were the traditional Barolo makers and the modern ones, and they would get in fights over this philosophy of what they were doing. And so I wouldn't be surprised to talk to some brewer and ask them about what they thought of this brewery who's doing this really modern thing, and it not being a very pleasant conversation about, or nothing nice to say about it. And that's fine. Some people are entrenched in what they're doing and they want to do that as perfectly as possible, whereas others are doing what they can. Some of it is marketing too. It's like, well, we're reinventing ourselves because we were making low quality sake for so long, and now we want to make less, and it's going to be quality driven, but we need a story to tell with that. And what's our story? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, speaking of sake stories, last week we tasted a wonderful sake with Nancy, and this week we have a wonderful brand that we're going to be tasting with Michael. So, John, do you want to introduce the sake that we have here to taste today with Michael?
Sure. Another one of my favorites. You guys have really good taste. So this week we're going to be tasting Hachinohe Shuzo's Mutsuha-sen brand, their black label Junmai Ginjo. And the rice here is Hanafubuki, polished down to 55% of its original size. The sake meter value, that measure of dryness, sweetness, is +1. 1.3 is the acidity, 16% alcohol, and Hachinohe Shuzo is located in Aomori Prefecture.
Now, Michael, you have a different sake from Mutsuha-sen with you. John and I are again going to be tasting that black label Junmai Ginjo. Which of the sakes from this brewery did you get your hands on for tasting today?
Well, it's a ginjo as opposed to a junmai gicho, which I think is really cool. It's interesting comparing there'll be some similarities, I'm sure. This one is with mashigura rice, which is a table rice. I'm not sure if it's actually from Aomori. I'm assuming it's grown in that area and they're using it for a reason. The seimai buai is 55% and 60%. I would guesstimate that the 55% is for their koji rice and their regular steamed rice. They left a little bit more of it on. The acidity is 1.6. The Nihon Shudo is -2. And I picked this brewery because of a few things. One, they're a brewery rooted in tradition, but also doing really cool modern things. And also their family is rooted in something we talk about in the book called the Omi Shonin, these merchants that existed in the Edo period that were quite powerful in terms of how widespread they were throughout Japan. And so Hachinohe Shuzo, their lineage comes from this Omi Shonin, and they basically was established in 1740 from the first Komai to leave. He left the Omi area of Shiga. The Omi Shonin or Omi merchants, but they're originate from this Omi region around Lake Biwa in Shiga Prefecture. And Shiga Prefecture, for those that don't know where it is, because it's kind of an off the beaten path. It's not as famous as some of the other prefectures per se, but it is home to the largest lake in Japan called Lake Biwa, but it's right beside Kyoto. And the roads kind of leading out of Kyoto would go through Shiga. And the Omi merchants were there. And so they even have a shop at the brewery called Omiya, Place of Omi, which I found interesting. And I remember when Nancy and I were there, we arrived at the train station and we had about a 10-minute walk there. And we had to go through this little fishing area, and which was really cool because Hachinohe has a thriving fishing industry. And then we arrived there, and right outside the brewery, we're just looking around, and there's a plaque that had the Omi reference as well. So it's really interesting to be so far away from the land of Omi down in Shiga, all the way in Aomori in the northeastern tip of the main island to see it. That was remarkable. Mm. And so the brewery makes two brands, Mutsu Hasen, which you mentioned, John, and the other, which is Mutsu Otokoyama. Mutsu Otokoyama, my understanding is it's a more traditional sake, and it's a local sake. Fishermen love it, that kind of thing. It's a drier style. And then Mutsu Hasen is allowed the brewery to really branch out and try really fun, modern things like these sakes that we're trying.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get this into the glass and take a look.
That was great pop. I love that.
I'm kind of stunned by that. I wasn't expecting that much.
Well, because this is another sake. I know last week we tried the Alpha by Yucho Shuzo, and that had a bit of bubble. This can have a little bit as well. It's just a very fresh style.
All right, let's give it a smell.
And Tim, I want to say, just like last week, I see those little bits floating in there too. It's most likely our little CO2 friends. Because that freshness, and it is just a hair off. It's not quite as clear as Niigata sake. I like how we're using that as our barometer for clear sake now.
Yeah, all right. Let's give it a smell.
That's really pleasantly fruity.
I think that's typical of the Mutsu Hasen sakes. They have that really nice fruit, but not overly unctuous. Like it's there and it's really fragrant, but not like it's going to fill in a room and really piss off everyone else in the room. That's like, well, I don't like that, you know?
So there's a hint of restraint on there. It's not too perfumed. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm getting, I don't know about yours, but I'm getting tropical fruits. So like passion fruit, pineapple, a little cotton candy, and a hint of star anise in there. And that fresh steamed rice quality that comes through. How about yours?
For me, the cotton candy definitely is front and center. That is something I often get from Mutsu Hasen stuff. And I don't mind at all because I happen to really enjoy that. So.
Michael, I was at a restaurant recently where we had the pink as sort of a dessert to sake. What do you think that you could see that? I imagine.
Yeah, it's fresh and clean, and that fruit, to me, it wouldn't be a dessert sake per se, but more like a palate cleanser. Like it's so clean on the palate that it would be definitely a great way of ending a meal. And pairing, I mean, it not a lot of residual sugar in it, but with the right dessert, particularly like Japanese desserts tend to be sweet without being too sweet. There's a subtle sweetness in there, and that would go really well with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, let's have a sip.
Delicious.
Yeah. This is dangerously drinkable. It fits into that category for me, most certainly.
Yeah. And for me, the black label, this Mutsuha Senju Maikinjo, has a nice compact structure, and it's really has just a hint of richness on the palate. And it's concentrates those fruity flavors, and it has a little, again, a very gentle, light touch, but a little bit of a jammy quality to it that I really, really like.
I feel like we're tasting the same sake, Timothy, and I can't imagine these are too far off in terms of how they're created. But I totally get that in this as well. It's like, if you smell it, and especially if you don't like anything too sweet, the nose has a bit of that sweet fruit smell. And it could be like, oh, is this going to be sweet? I don't want this. And I like dry things. I tend to like drier sake. And I think when you have this on the palate, it's very clean. You get a bit of that richness, and then it's really tightly compact, as you say.
That's really, really luscious. So I do have to say, for the record, that I am super jealous of the research trips you guys got to do through Japan. And writing book is hard work for sure. But thinking back to all the chapters I read, one after the other, you really got a sense of how this was a travel log. And the moment you left one brewery, you were showing up at a koji factory or the research center where flower yeast is created. And I just can't recommend your book enough to people who want to get a sense of what it's really like, the inside and outside of the sake industry in Japan. You both did such a good job of pulling back the curtain and letting people have a glimpse into what it's like to travel through the sake industry. And so much is beautifully explained that you don't ever feel lost or what are they talking about. So really great job with that. That was one of my favorite parts of your book.
Thank you so much. That's such a kind comment. And it makes me really happy because it was all about telling a good story and really kind of making it that travel log experience where just throwing in fun stuff that happens when you travel. I think that's what makes a book fun to read, if it's mixed in with all the other history and culture and technical stuff.
When Nancy and I met, we knew each other. We were friends here in Toronto, but we'd never traveled together either. So it's like, okay, we're going to write a book together. Okay, let's do trip number one. And you're visiting 3 or 4 breweries a day. You don't know how you're going to travel together. You just hope for the best. And It's going to be a very, very long research trip if you don't. And I think we complement each other in many ways. For instance, when we're out at the sake bar and they pour our glasses, I would always drink some of Nancy's. I'm just teasing Nancy.
It's no secret.
What a gentleman. What a gentleman.
No, it's no secret. I am a lightweight. You can tell after I've had a little bit of sake that I've been drinking sake. Yes.
No shame in that game.
I've that age and enzyme.
All right. Well, I'm curious. So if our listeners are interested in picking up your book, which we highly recommend, where is the best place to get their hands on a copy of your book, and where can they go to learn more?
Well, we're on all of the major booksellers whose names you all know. Many of our friends have very nobly said, I'm not buying from them and I'm waiting for it to get to my local independent. So we've kind of made a little project of going to some of these bookstores to sign books. So we were at Kitchen Arts and Letters, which is an amazing bookstore on the Upper East Side of Manhattan that I highly recommend. An incredible place for cookbooks and books about drink. We're in Kinokuniya, we sign books there. And then here in Toronto, we were at Queen Books, which is in Michael's neighborhood, and also coming to the Danforth bookstore. So I would say it's trickling into even the local bookstores, definitely on the online sellers. And I think it's available through the Key website, right, Michael?
It is, yeah. We bought a bunch of copies. So if you're visiting Toronto and you're not from Toronto, bring your book if you bought it, or if not, stop in the Key and we're selling it there. And Nancy and I autographed a whole bunch of them as well.
And also we have websites. Mine is nancymatsumoto.com. Michael has his Sake Scholar website, and we're on social media. I'm Nancy Matsumoto.
And I'm MTR Sake.
So if you're interested in learning about where to buy the book and how to connect with Nancy or Michael on the social media, we'll have it all linked up in our show notes. Michael and Nancy, thank you so much for introducing us to your wonderful book. It was so great to learn about it, and I could really pick up on all your passion for sake, and it was so great to taste sake with both of you as well. We certainly do encourage our listeners to run, not walk, and go pick up your fantastic book, Exploring the World of Japanese Craft Sake. And we can't wait to have you back on the show for a future episode.
Thank you.
All right. I'd like to send out a special thank you to our patrons. Thanks to your generosity, we are able to produce, edit, and bring you a new episode of Sake Revolution each and every week. If you'd like to show your support for the show, please visit us at patreon.com/Sake Revolution.
And if you're a listener out there who wants to contact us directly, please email us at feedback@sakerevolution.com. We do look forward to hearing from you guys. So until next time, please grab a glass. Remember to keep drinking sake and
Kanpai!